It's been 2 years since Bondware released Poser 12 to mixed opinions, not least from me. Now they are proudly claiming that Poser 13, released at the end of March, is, quote, the best Poser release in years. That's a bold claim, although the program has only had one other release in the past 7 or more years. But does it live up to their hype? Okay, so there are releases and there are releases. There are releases packed with shiny new features such as improved physics systems, particle smoke, new modelling tools, sparkly new figures with incredible textures, and then there's what Bondware has just released. If this was a game, I'd call it DLC or a point release. Typically, point releases of software are intermediate versions that do not wow with new features, rather they fix the bugs and make the existing features work better. But perhaps I'm being unreasonable, because there are new features and new content, so much content. I always thought that Smith Micro was misguided to concentrate on promoting its third-rate content, and frankly, when I saw Bondware going all in on content, repeatedly placing it front and centre in their marketing, I started to get a sinking feeling. After all, if content was their big selling point, then they didn't have much to offer. I'll return to that later. Another of the selling points was Unimesh figure support that made it easier to create figures and morphs. They said, a key goal for this release has been to simplify content creation for Poser by supporting single mesh figures that remain in memory and are not broken up into smaller segments internally by the software, aka Unimesh. At the last second they pulled the rug on that one. They also do not include the super high quality figure that they promised, saying that it too will come later. Which brings me to my first major criticism. When you buy the program, it is sold as a finished and complete product. When you then go to the download page, the release notes say, quote, this is an early access release, meaning that some features are still being refined and subsequent downloads, installs of updates may be required. Bondware pulled this with Poser 12 and it never officially left early access. This is simply a way of avoiding accountability for delivering a fully functional program. Bondware, you don't get to sell a program now on the promises of what you may or may not deliver in future. I trust only what is delivered now, not what is promised for the future. That said, Bondware did release many patches and updates for Poser 12, so they do have some goodwill in this regard. So, what are the flagship features in this version? Bondware proclaims, quote, an updated Superfly render engine utilising the latest open source Cycles engine. But read that carefully. The render engine, not the Cycles features. There are still plenty of Cycles nodes that cannot be used in Poser, so you can't always reproduce Blender materials in Poser. Blender is the incredible free 3D program widely used by millions of artists, and which Poser's physically based render engine utilises. The nodes that do exist have now been alphabetically listed rather than organised by importance, making them easier to navigate. There are a number of rendering features that I really like. With Poser 12, if it encountered errors in the way that Poser surface nodes were set up, it often simply refused to render the entire scene. Now it powers through those same scenes with no trouble, and I do mean powers. Yet again, Bondware has improved rendering speed, at least for owners of optics-capable graphics cards. I benchmarked the improvement at up to 40%, and Bondware claims a 100% improvement, which is significant especially for owners of older graphics cards such as the RTX 2000 series or lower-spec modern cards. I've linked a list of compatible cards in the underbar. The previous gargantuan speed improvement was the real game changer, but faster is always appreciated, and even 40% is nothing to sneer at, especially when animating. I also noticed that the render bucket size has been increased from the old default of 64 up to a more reasonable level between 128 and 512, depending on the render default. The bucket size indicates the number of pixels that the program will render at a time, and with lots more memory and CUDA cores, modern GPUs can handle much larger buckets, meaning faster rendering. You can manually change this value, but many users never dig that far under the hood, so this is a smart move. I run it at 1024 on an RTX 3090. If you you're fortunate enough to own more than one PC, you can distribute rendering tasks across your network so that the load is shared and in turn accelerated. Better yet, Poser 13 will now even utilise NVIDIA cards in other machines for that really impressive speed boost. With version 12, you could install Queue Manager on an unlimited number of machines, whereas now you can only install it on 3 before having to pay additional $99 licenses for each machine. Bondware says that this is to pay for the cost of implementing enhanced network rendering, but surely that's what the program cost is for in the first place. My instinct is to balk at this seemingly money-grabbing surcharge, but it's not uncommon for professional 3D software to charge for extra render nodes, and I doubt very many Poser users will be networking with more than 3 PCs together. Sadly, perhaps I've become normalised to companies nickel and diming us at every opportunity. I will just add one positive. In a world where every company is switching to incredibly greedy monthly or yearly licensing, where you never own a program outright, and you are not provided extra value for extra money, looking at you, Adobe, with Poser, at least a single payment lets you own the program in perpetuity. Returning to cycles, while there are no new nodes, Bondware does claim an improvement of rendering quality. I noticed that the new engine handles specularity a little differently in some cases, boosting the levels even further than Superfly did over Firefly. Final image quality is not visibly improved overall, so I can only assume that Bondware is referring to the effects of bloom and HDRI lighting. The render settings panel has been simplified. If you choose branched path for CPU rendering, now called legacy branched path, the tuning parameters that used to be on offer below no longer exist. If you choose optics rendering, the branched path option is greyed out entirely, preventing you from accidentally creating monstrous and unnecessary render times. One significant absence for me from Poser's implementation of the Cycles render engine is microfacet displacement, more properly called micropolygon displacement. Displacement is a way of creating more 3D detail using bitmaps to change the surface at render time. Think of it as bump maps on steroids. Its absence means that displacement continues to be coupled to geometry resolution rather than the resolution of the image used to produce it. This completely defeats the purpose of displacement as a resource saver. Not only is this slower to render, but it also hugely increases the load on your GPU because you have to increase mesh resolution to avoid chunky displacement. In a recent, somewhat vague Bondware post, a closer look at Poser 13's Superfly renderer, NemIRC suggests that if you want to create glass, skin, or a specific type of fabric, but you don't know how to do it, you can look for a way to create that material for Cycles and just recreate the material recipe into Poser 13's material room. But that's not always true. Not all Cycle shaders can be reproduced in Poser. Another absent feature that has been long present in Blender is color preview of Cycles materials in the working window. This means that Cycles figures show up in Poser as white as you set up your scenes. One feature that Bondware has made much about is the addition of 6 new PostFX filters: Gamma, Contrast, Brightness, Bloom, Blur and Pixelate. I have complained vociferously about the fact that Bondware never added to the list in Poser 12, and frankly I was exceedingly sceptical about all of them except Bloom, but then I discovered something that somehow slipped past me in Poser 12. I quite correctly noted that most of the features in the PostFX were better and easily achieved in Photoshop or your image editor of choice, so it was a waste to add them as gimmicks in Poser. But here's what I discovered. If you right-click on a rendered image in the renders list, it offers an option to edit PostFX. You can then use this option to move sliders around, adjusting values individually or collectively to your taste, seeing the results in real time. And that is easier than Photoshop, where you'd have to apply each effect individually. The original incredibly useful Intel denoiser is still included. This enables you to render at a much lower resolution for speed, then denoise the result to produce decent quality. The previous version had a single setting, on, but now you can specify the level of denoising. Personally, I don't envision using less than 100%, but some may like that level of granular control. Then there's the other really nice PostFX, Bloom. This simulates the soft fuzziness that is visible around lights, particularly in photographs and on film, or if you look at a bright bulb. It also affects any light reflecting object in the scene. This feature has a few parameters and really adds a lovely tool to your rendering arsenal, and one that cannot be easily replicated in Photoshop without a lot of effort. I still think that Bondware missed an enormous opportunity by not adding film grading and other lighting options to PostFX, but at least they're progressing. A quick warning, the default settings in PostFX render the scene to black. This is because the exposure and saturation dials are set to -1. Turn them to 0 to fix the problem. Once installed and registered, the program happily runs offline, making it fine for using away from your home. Bondware has even gone so far as to provide the nice online manual in PDF form as well. Compare this to DAS, who have never released a fully comprehensive manual, online or otherwise, for their enormously complicated DAS Studio. Another new feature that left me distinctly unimpressed when I read it, but actually turns out to be much more useful than I had anticipated, is the launcher. In the past, the program automatically loaded the default scene or the preferred scene if you changed that option in Preferences. Now, unless you disable it, you are greeted by the launcher. The top part offers you the option to load recent saves. Unfortunately, there's still no Clear Recent, Clear History option. The bottom offers you the option to load one of a number of predefined startup scenes, including the old Preferred State launch scene. Developer Workspace is an evenly lit, empty scene for content creators. Empty scene contains nothing whatsoever. Factory and LeFem base each contain one single figure and the construct. There is also an alternate construct with really basic morphing terrain. This could have been so much more versatile, but is unlikely to wow you as it is. Turn its subdivision up to 3 and it becomes much more useful. Bondware has also added a couple of backgrounds to both constructs: black, white, grey, neutral, and a desert scene. The most interesting scenes must be installed as additional content, and they are Mondello Beach and Wide Street. These represent a valuable step forwards and are also a poorly implemented immense disappointment. They are pre-configured 360-degree high dynamic range HDRI background scenes. HDRI images use the image to light the scene, supplemented if required by additional standard lights. They provide a leap in lighting realism, and although Poser has featured image-based lighting for many versions, it was always a poor man's HDRI. Content creator Snarly Gribbly produced his own HDRI dome scripts, but users have been hoping for something native. Sadly, this is the worst possible implementation. For starters, it's immensely overcomplicated. HDRI in Poser 13 has 3 components: environment preview, background, and the preview light. There's no one-click way to change the HDRI image loaded into them anytime you want to change HDRIs. Also, although Bondware points you to a free source of SIBL images, which also include a sunlight location, it doesn't bother to create a sunlight when you load either of those 2 scenes, which Snarly's Easy Dome did. Bondware further compounds their awful design. If you create a blank scene, then decide later on that you want to add an environment sphere, you will find it lurking inconspicuously in the primitives folder of the props library. Once you load it, you'll get a blank sphere. Absolutely nothing is wired in the material room, ready for you to load in your own images. Another issue that people have complained about is the difficulty in rotating the scene. You can rotate the preview, but then the underlying HDRI scene renders in the original orientation. Okay, now it's time to talk about the big one, content. Bondware has gone on at considerable length both about how much content is included, described unhelpfully in terms of its 25GB file size, and about the fact that the installer is much smaller, 400 megabytes as opposed to 1.7 gigs. They've achieved this by separating off the content into separate downloads, exactly as it always was before they bought the program. Don't make something worse, then tell me you're doing me a favour by returning it to how it was. We all remember the story of new and improved Coke. Also, we live in a high-speed internet age where games top out at 100 gigabytes or more, so perhaps 1.7 gigs was not so bad. Let's also remember the reason Poser 12 was 1.7 gigs was because it was poorly designed. Bondware told us proudly how their new agile methodology would make it easier to deploy changes, but then force us to download the entire 1.7 gig program each and every time they made the smallest bug fix or change. Incremental patches were not part of their philosophy. To be clear, Poser has always had a considerable amount of bloatware, figures and scenes and animals that the average artist would never use, and now it includes much, much more, although it's optional to download. Many people will doubtless also appreciate that old legacy figures are still available. The new content is variable in quality, from pretty decent scenes like the Great Lake and Medieval Manor, to embarrassingly low quality like the neighbourhood scene. When you install a program, if you go to the Purchases tab, you will see many categories of content that you can download. In some cases, you can install individual figures, a Superfly textured cat, La Femme, etc. Then, when it comes to scenery and props, there are simply 4 unspecified folders, no thumbnails, totaling 3.8 gigabytes. Installing these provides a vast range of scenery and buildings. Also, the installer progress bar is broken. If you defocus or switch to other screens mid-download, it simply freezes at the point it was up to, although the download continues invisibly in the background. The supplied content is where my ambivalence, even outright hostility at times towards Bondware, starts to soften. The scenes are mostly legacy stuff, doubtless acquired from store vendors. Some of the content stretches back seemingly a decade or more. Texturing and modelling that far back was often pretty awful, and it really shows in some cases. There's a gulf between this content and modern products, let alone the exceptional DAS content. But damn it, there are just so many scenes, and they are so varied. I just can't help but warming to what Bondware has tried to do. They've tried to provide a comprehensive starter kit that absolute beginners can use without spending another cent. Yes, DAS content is superb, but so expensive relatively. A single scene might cost $30 or more, and a single clothed figure easily retails for over $100, often much more. Here, Bondware has provided over 50 scenes, hundreds of props, plants, animals, humans, shaders, lights, cameras, furniture, hair, poses, skies, terrains, and so much more. Is it going to win any quality awards? No, not by and large, but does it represent, even at the full $250 asking price, much less the $100 upgrade, a good value? No. It represents a superb value. I have a content library running to terabytes, yet at $100 this was an easy sell, even if I hadn't bought the program to review. I'd like to think that Bondware listened to my wish list when they also included a decent library of Superfly materials, including strand hair and even physical surface shaders, in case you are importing substance materials. The range of scenes alone is so diverse that yes, you'll never use most, but you'll certainly use many. I personally love the desert scene, fitness room, urban decay, the medieval houses, locker room, lake and canyon scenes. I am disheartened to discover that Bondware did not bother to tweak the contents materials for Superfly, as doing so represents a significant amount of work, if users even had the experience to do so. I'm not interested in Firefly optimized content. This seems at odds with their messaging about how good the Superfly engine is, even if they don't fully commit to Cycles materials. How long does the program need a vastly superior rendering engine before Bondware treats that as the default? I have never been a fan of included content, arguing that if I want content, I'll buy exactly what I want. But I must say, wading through the vast library of content provided, I started to feel an emotion towards Bondware that I've not experienced in perhaps a decade. A kind of affection for the sheer thoughtfulness that seems to have gone into choosing this. I can imagine a panel of people asking, what would our customers find useful and love? Apparently not genitals on Le Homme, but it's a small price to pay, and an odd one given that the other males are not similarly bereft. Also, the female poses, clothes and content significantly outweighs the male stuff. Clearly, turning the program into a masterpiece overnight is way beyond Bondware's budget or technical expertise. But with this content drop, they have made a huge effort to make up for it in kind. But enough of that soppiness, let's get back to the rest of the program. The previous version was the most bug-riddled release ever. I've seen reports of bugs with this version and encountered quite a few more. I also had the program crash on exit, which can be a real bummer if your configuration file is lost and you have to redefine all your hotkeys, library preferences or more. The program does not allow you to back up preferences nor to import them from earlier program versions, but given its occasional habit of trashing your preferences, this would have been a nice idea. Changing between preview modes sometimes does not work and has to be manually overridden by the object mode option. Manually typing in a new subdivision level, rather than changing the subdivision, will also sometimes resize or reset the object. As someone who uses multiple different resolution screens, one huge annoyance is the way that the UI scales as it moves between monitors, using absolute rather than relative scales. Bondware still hasn't addressed the limitation with the lighting preview inaccurately missing lights out and being incapable of rendering shadows fully. I was told that they might switch from OpenGL to a more capable lighting API, but this has clearly not happened. With the previous version, I complained bitterly that Bondware had killed the area render, where you could render, make a change, such as where an eye was looking, then render only the changed part directly on top of the previous image, saving the time needed to render the whole image. Unfortunately, this still does not work with PostFX. With each speed improvement, this becomes less relevant, but I am mindful of the fact that I have the luxury of a powerful render machine, whereas many people I know work on computers 10 or even 15 years old. One workaround would be to render without PostFX, using the area render on those images. Then activate the PostFX from the render menu as described earlier. But for some inscrutable reason, Bondware does not enable you to render PostFX on all images in the render stack, so this option is eliminated. Another tiny but significant interface issue is the comparison slider beneath the render screen. This enables you to drag the slider to compare between renders, and now feels very squishy and unresponsive. The walk and talk designers have been upgraded. The theory behind the changes is a good one. Each figure has its own parameter files, so you create walks and talk that match their characteristics, rather than based on a generic figure. For example, the hip sway of a female is very different to the way a male walks. Unfortunately, the La Homme figure walks like a woman, and the La Femme figure's legs pass through each other at the ankles, so this was clearly not well bug tested. The animation export has been totally redesigned, and dialogues more logically positioned. Although it is not at all intuitive at first glance, it makes so much sense once you understand it. Now, rather than rendering directly to your desired final format, every animation is first rendered as a sequence of images. As a bit of an animation Luddite, I have always rendered straight to whatever format I needed, MP4 or AVI most likely. But this is a bad working practice. If there is an interruption to the render, I lose the entire animation. Whereas, rendering as frames, I can simply resume from where the render was interrupted, then use the Encode Images option to produce the final animation. This requires immensely more disk space, but when you can buy 20 terabyte hard drives for $400, that's no longer an issue. After the animation has been rendered, you can tell the program to auto-assemble, auto-delete the frames, or you can keep them as a frame sequence. This is a terrific working practice, and though I had to be dragged to it kicking and screaming, I approve. I was pleasantly surprised that the program automatically detected Poser 12 scripts that I had installed using the Install from Zip function. I was not surprised to learn that it did not pick up the scripts I had manually installed, but I hear that Snarly's Easy Skin no longer works, which has grave implications. There's a strange flex in Bondware's marketing, a greatly enhanced shadow catcher. Shadow catcher is a function applied via a material room script that enables you to render shadows separately from the object they are casting onto. This is useful for compositing objects into other scenes in your image editing software. The manual says Shadow Catcher doesn't work with Superfly, but that's incorrect. When you run it in Superfly with poser surface node materials, the objects simply lose their materials but do not act as proper shadow catchers either. You can't use it at all with cycles. Why would Bondware promote a feature that doesn't work with their flagship material engine? That would be like DAS promoting a feature that doesn't work with iRay. You'll find some minor changes in the General Preferences menu. There are more launch options, and under Render Process, the Render to Separate Processes option for multi-threaded rendering has disappeared. This was a stability option, so whether Bondware thinks it is no longer needed or simply doesn't work, I can't tell. Multi-threaded bending has also been deleted. Perhaps now that multi-core CPUs are becoming ubiquitous, Bondware has optimized for them as standard. One preferences change that I was happy to see is the ability to specify the location of your render cache. That means that you can direct Poser's EXR format renders to a location of your choosing prior to exporting them in your own preferred format. So, should you buy Poser 13? There's not a lot of substantive new meat to get your teeth into. If you like content as an upgrade, it's a total no-brainer. For $100 you receive easily $500, perhaps over $1,000 worth of content, plus a new version of the program that is more stable, fixes but also ignores some long-standing issues, renders faster, makes animation easier, adds a bunch of quality of life improvements, and is a more pleasant experience than the previous version, though not without introducing a whole bunch of new issues. For $250, even though the content has a much higher value, I just don't think the average new purchaser is going to want to roll the dice on such an eclectic range of content, especially as Bondware doesn't specifically itemize them in advance. I've said it before and I'll say it again. In my opinion, Bondware has entirely the wrong attitude towards Poser. Poser is a vehicle for their software sales, not a means unto itself. It's like Epson selling $50 inkjet printers so they can sell you $500 worth of high markup ink. Ironically, by including so much content, Bondware may have harmed that objective. I get it, they want to attract new users with a vast library out of the box, but then, beyond stating the size of the content in gigabytes, they've done nothing to leverage that asset. And frankly, my suspicions about the competence of the marketing department continue unabated. Moreover, I just don't see a new user being willing to drop $250 on a mystery pick and mix of content. Perhaps $500 of store credits from a curated selection, then selling the program for $100 would have been a smarter play. But Bondware continues to act as though they are not competing in a world where DAS Studio exists for free with its vastly superior content library. If you do buy the program new for $250, I certainly don't think that you'll be receiving a poor value, and you can give it a 21-day tryout for free. The program is easier to use than DAS, more coherent, it's easier to access pro features, has an excellent industry-standard physically based rendering engine, improved, if horrendously implemented, HDRI, and much more besides. Bondware has endeavoured to add something to appeal to everyone. They have perhaps spread their focus a little thin, and in so doing, failed to provide much in the way of brand new functionality. For me, the question is, who is their primary user base? I'm going to bet that the vast majority are long-term users loyal to the program. Trying to attract new users is essential for the program's survival, but not at the cost of its foundation base. The Unreal 5 real-time game engine has redefined the bar about what people can expect in terms of 3D scenes, albeit with the might of a multi-billion-dollar company behind it. Poser artists have to work much harder to come close to scenes that relative novices can create with DAS Studio, and that's on Bondware. Superior lighting, strand-based hair and eyebrows, and excellent characters give artists on that platform a huge leg up. That said, incredible poser artists such as Ghost Ship, Yura, Aphrodite Oki, and Calypso prove that Poser 13 is capable of producing stunning art if you are willing to master it. Perhaps I will develop an even deeper appreciation for the new Cycles render engine over time, but Bondware's efforts to showcase and elucidate that new functionality so far have fallen far short in most cases. They need to do better. It's no good hiding its light under a bushel. I'm concerned that their marketing briefs for the program sail extremely close to being disingenuous, which surprises me as the company has always touted its high-minded morality. This is primarily a quality of life release. It's a solid upgrade, but I would like to have seen more features to wow me. Fluid, smoke, DAS compatibility, background colour matching, sub-poly displacement, much better lighting and previews, simultaneous GPU and CPU rendering, and even small refinements such as file thumbnails, the option to rename files, and more. I'm happy I bought the upgrade and would not hesitate to do so again, but it could have been so much better. I really hope that Bondware will endeavour to blow us away with the next version.